Is it still morning? No.
Somewhere in the world.
Somewhere there. I hope you're all doing well. It's been a great day so far. I don't know if any of you were with us for the last session. We were talking about integrated pest management and really thinking about how to get more diversity into our cropping systems. So this session we're going to be talking about how do we get markets to work with that? How do we create markets for diverse cropping systems and talk a bit to people that are making that work. I work with a European project called Diver Impacts, and part of that is looking at value chains and how in different countries, how they're making it work, some of the steps around kind of separation, processing and getting those links between consumers and farmers. So part of that is a case study with a company called Hobmidods. I don't know how many people have come across Hobmidods. Lots of you, good stuff. So Hobmidods are all about supporting farmers to diversify their cropping system and grow pulses that we can link this kind of growing trend for plant-based diets with the agronomic benefits on farm as well, and how we kind of work with consumer education around that. So really delighted to have these guys together here today. We're all part, I think we could say, of a network called Grain Lab, which I'll get you guys to talk about a bit more later on. But Grain Lab's all about bringing together bakers, millers, farmers to work together, basically. So maybe what we'll do is we'll have a bit of a chat. It's very much welcome to share your own experiences, questions, But if we kick off, if we all introduce ourselves. Oh, I didn't introduce myself, did I? We'll all introduce ourselves and we'll go from there. So my name's Katie Bliss. I work with Agricology. Agricology is a community of researchers and farmers sharing knowledge on agroecology. So looking at how is it working in practice, how is it working in research, and we're doing that online and at in-field events. So you can learn all about that afterwards. And yourself?
I'm Stephen Jacobs. We play juggle the microphone. I work for Organic Farmers and Growers, but I'm also part of Agricology and I'm also part of Grain Lab, and I chair the Welsh Grain Forum, and so it's all about bringing the chain together to make a network. So it's not just food production, it's not just food sales, it's everything.
Hello, I'm Fred. I'm a farmer at Goltheney Farm down in Somerset, Bridgewater. I guess I've been farming 10 years, and the first few years I was really forced to chase yield in a pretty commodity-driven business model, and that's because you're trying to reduce your cost of production per tonne. And if you're trying to kind of step off of that model, you need to actually believe there's something else out there. And one thing I would say is people introduce me as like a big farmer or part of the Grain Lab producing heritage wheat. And actually, if there's a bit of advice to start with, is that don't try and think of the market and create some niche product. Think about your farming system, unpick what's wrong with it, put something in place that's right. And for me, the two big levers of that are carbon and diversity. And so we've ended up with a pig enterprise that's totally reverse engineered to deliver some of the more positive aspects of our farming system. And we're looking at heritage wheats because they're low input wheats for zero input agricultural systems. Start really with your system and work forward, and that's where what we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 years particularly, and ended up as a pig farmer from a commercial arable farmer producing commodities. And so this year we won't put anything on a lorry. Everything's face to face, not with necessarily individuals, but restaurants or chefs or bakers, millers. So there's a human face to everything that we do now. I'm sure we can go into it, but anyway, I'm Fred. Hello.
Hey, I'm George. I farm in South Essex, and my kind of key drivers are producing sustainable food and fibre, really nutritional food, ecology, and then education. So the ecological aspect drove us down a route of zero tillage and since then zero insecticides as well, and kind of then trying to take away fungicides, so really kind of strip all the inputs out of the system as much as I can, And then by doing that, you suddenly realise you need to kind of change up the way that you're farming. So kind of similarly to Fred, I've been looking kind of from two aspects as to what kind of cropping we should be doing. So I look from one aspect, agronomically, what works really well. So looking kind of for different kind of heights of crops that are growing, things that do different stuff to the ground to change the soil. And then also looking from a nutritional perspective as to what, as a human race, we actually require, and saying, right, well, we should probably be trying to grow this crop or trying to grow that crop and seeing how it does. And I kind of take the aspect that I'm not necessarily worried about the market first. So I'll grow something on a small scale, have a go, see what it does, and play around from there. So that's kind of me.
And can you tell us a bit, George, about what's in the ground this year? What's in your cropping system?
So the first thing I've been farming 6 years, and I always like to grow things that look really pretty. So I discovered buckwheat about 5 years ago. Realised that it mines phosphorus from the soil, it's great for bees, and it grows in a really short period of time and has great herbicidal properties. These are all things that are really useful agronomically. It also happens to be really delicious. So we've got buckwheat in the ground. I grew buckwheat for the first time last year, which I'm growing for hodmedods. I grow it essentially organic no-till, which means it has one part of glyphosate before it goes in the ground, and that's it. It's fantastic for wildlife in the farm. It goes in the ground nice and late. We've actually got bees have come down from Lincolnshire all the way to Essex. They came down yesterday, which is quite exciting for some buckwheat honey. I think the beekeepers are quite excited because they don't normally get the chance to get buckwheat honey, and that's quite prized. So we've got buckwheat in the ground, and actually that's really flying this year. Got no rain last year. We're also carrying on trying lentils, also for hodmedods. Again, the second year trying them. As a bit of a benchmark as to how good a farmer I am, last year we planted 75 kilograms of lentils, and we managed to harvest all 75 kilograms of lentils.
Brilliant!
On top of that, they had a bit of barley in as well, so that was a nice bonus. I also played around. I tried to have a go with teff this year. Has anyone actually heard of teff? Oh, okay, well that's a better shout than normal.
Tell us more.
Otherwise known as Williams lovegrass, which is a bit more of a sexy name. Teff I actually heard about through my sister. Her son was struggling with dairy, so my sister was off dairy when she was breastfeeding, and so she was looking for different ways of getting calcium in her diet. And she came across teff, which is really, really high in calcium, high in iron, really nutritious. So I thought I'd have a go at growing that. It's it's a pseudo grain, so it's from Ethiopia, and you wouldn't believe how small the seed is. If you think clover seed is small, you're wrong. Try and grow teff. I'm actually quite glad. As it happened, I found out since that it must have been steam treated because nothing grew. I bought a pack from Amazon thinking something would grow. Nothing grew, but when I put it in the drill, I was pouring in the drill and it was pouring out the bottom through the holes. So I'm glad I didn't have to try and combine it. And then the other thing we're trying this year, having fought tooth and nail with the Home Office, we finally got a licence to grow hemp. Apparently there are only 13 people in the UK with a licence to grow hemp now. Obviously it used to be big with Hempcore and all these things, but I think in today's world of climate change, hemp is so important. It is so useful in so many different aspects of life, with plastics and paper, food. The fact, again, agronomically speaking, the fact that it's a 120-day crop. I mean, they've got a fibre crop now that grows 3.5 metres in 120 days, which is just insane. So it's not growing that well because the licence came through late and I planted 3 weeks after I wanted to. But it's in the ground and we'll see how it grows and see how it fits in our system. But yeah, those are kind of the fun stuff this year, I think.
Fantastic. And the buckwheat, there's some talk around buckwheat and weed control. Have you noticed anything with that? Any impact on the crop?
Yeah, buckwheat's quite. It's. I don't know quite how it does it because I don't think it's allelopathy that is killing off the other weeds, but there's some kind of chemical thing going on. Certainly last year, I mean, it went in late and didn't have any rain, and it all came up full of groundswell, not groundswell. That's where we are. All came up full of groundswell, and we had the lentils next door that the groundswell never really disappeared, and then all this groundswell was there, and suddenly the buckwheat punched away, all the groundswell died, and I think there was one or two wild oats poking out the top of the buckwheat, and that was it. The one slight, not a mistake because the wheat is okay now, but we harvested our buckwheat on the 28th of September and we planted the following wheat crop within a week of that. And apparently you're meant to give it about 6 weeks, which I didn't know about. And you want to give it a little bit of time because you could definitely tell when a buckwheat was in the wheat for a while after. So it definitely has some form of herbicidal property. William at Hodmedod's actually quite wants to run a trial where you kind of spin buckwheat out a little while after you've sown the wheat, because the buckwheat will grow and then die off in the frost, so you won't have any weed problems or anything like that. But potentially there's a chance for the buckwheat to grow up and kill off some of the other weeds growing.
And can you talk, because if we're looking at growing these new crops, it's a different process, isn't it? Can you talk us through that buckwheat crop from where you get the seed from through to how it's going to get to consumers? What steps has it gone through? Well, let's start with where did you get this? How do you get hold of the seed? Is there seed available that's adapted to UK climate, or are you testing it out?
So the seed actually came from via Hodmedod's, via a conversation I had with Josiah. I'm not sure I love the variety. Find out. I like the way it grows, but actually with Katie we went out to France a couple of months ago and we were looking at some buckwheat growers out there and what they do with it. And there are some other varieties I definitely want to try, but in terms of getting seed, I mean, similarly with the hemp, I had to go to France to get the hemp seed, and I think I'll be doing similar with trialling some buckwheat varieties next year. In terms of growing it, I mean, you plant it at 50 kilos a hectare, it grows nice and easy. The growing part's easy. The combining is a bit fun. There are some parts of the world that swath it, but when you're combining at the end of September, the last thing you want to be doing in this country is swathing it and picking it up. In a lot of places where they get a guaranteed frost in November, they'll leave it till the frost, which will kill it, and then go and direct combine it. What we did was direct combine it green, and surprisingly it works quite well. Something we did learn was it did pack all the concaves out on the combine, which my combine mechanics just sorted out yesterday, so that's something. So what we're doing this year is actually leaving a strip of wheat, which we'll combine at the end of September after we've combined the buckwheat, just to kind of wash the combine through with that, so hopefully that'll make a difference. But the big thing with buckwheat is, because you combine it wet, when we tipped it out of a trailer, there's a blog on this on YouTube if anyone's interested, I'm Farming George. Anyway, we tipped it out of a trailer and it literally heaped on the floor like that, so Dad and I set about and spread it all about and got air through it and dried it in about 5 days. But if you leave buckwheat without putting ambient air through it, if you leave it more than a few hours, it's gone, it's tainted and it can't be used for food. One of the things, considering we're talking about trying to break this commodity gap, when you start looking at these kind of things, there is always inevitably a degree more effort that goes into managing these crops. So obviously I had to dry it. There's a peculiarly different attitude that you have to a crop in your shed when you know the end market is going to and you know the people it's going to, rather than going off to a mass group of people like Frontier or whomever. You don't really necessarily care quite the same, and you'll bucket it out and it goes in a lorry and you say goodbye to it. When you really care about something and then you've got the dresses in and they've got it cleaned and bagged up, you really start having a lot of pride in that product. You really start to care about it as a food grade product, which gives a lot more excitement, but there's obviously a modicum of more risk associated with that as well. But then interestingly, certainly with buckwheat, what we're finding at the moment is we don't have the infrastructure in the UK to be converting it into that food product yet. So it's looking into the processing side of that equation, which if anyone likes words, decorticate, fantastic word. Decorticate is when you actually take the outer hull off the buckwheat and get the groat out of the middle. That's what you need to do to kind of turn it into a genuine food product. If you mill it with an Austrian mill, it's very difficult to get a decent quality flour out for galettes. I think a French mill will work better. You start learning that there are very different types of mills out there, and then very different end products as well. So we're kind of a little bit away along that chain.
Brilliant, thank you. What about you, Fred? What's in the ground this year? What are you playing around with?
Well, we're about 250 acres, and from 10 years ago, all arable. Now, probably 150 of those acres go into the pig setup. So we graze them on herbal lays and produce zero input barley and beans that go into a TMR with lucerne silage to finish them. And then that leaves about 75 acres of cereal crops. And all the cereals that we're growing are actually what I would call low input varieties. So we've tried to bypass the bottlenecks of modern plant breeding in kind of the, I'm not sure of the date exactly, the 50s or 60s when you get the dwarfing gene coming in. We've gone to gene banks and multiplied up seed from 5 grams, and this year we've probably got 160, 170 acres of heritage wheats and barleys, basically because they were grown in under conditions where you couldn't resort to a can or a bag, so they really suit a low input system. And that's some of them going to the pigs, and some of them we're starting to build a sort of supply network for those. And the whole principle of that is basically trying to get the business to a point where we eliminate any risk from the business by setting a market price. And when I say setting it, I don't mean plucking a number out of thin air and thinking like, right, let's get rich. I mean trying to find who's going to buy it, sitting around a table, and actually also building a supply chain. Supply chains in conventional commodity systems, we have the perception of them as extracting value from us. You know, you pick up the phone to a trader and you say, what price? They say a price you're unhappy with, and then you sell it anyway. And in a year where you have a lot of something, hey presto, everyone else does as well. So they don't really look after you as a small farmer, commodity markets. But that doesn't mean supply chains are necessarily bad. So for me, it's about building the right kind of supply chain and having really deep relationships right through it. So for the pigs, we've got a butcher that looks after us and adds a huge amount of value in hanging our pork for 4 or 5 weeks. And we know where the restaurants are going, and the restaurants and the chefs down to see the farm. And that kind of total traceability and transparency, I think, could be applied to grain supply chains as well. I mean, for instance, I probably only need to find 3 or 4 bakers using about a tonne of grain a week. And that's my entire grain production on the farm now. And then there's questions about yield if we're going from conventional to zero input. You know, we don't have to chase 10 or 12 tonne a hectare anymore. We can move, my hand's shaking. We can move towards 5 or 6 tonne a hectare, because when you sit around a table with the baker and a miller and you all put your figures on the table and be transparent about it, it's actually surprising what number you can get to. So rather than thinking about commodity markets where you don't set your price, and therefore you have to reverse engineer your farming system to produce as much cheap food as possible. If you start by sitting around the table with a product that somebody actually wants to eat, you can actually start from what your yield is going to be, and that's based on what farming system you've built. For me, that means zero input, and then you can work a price that they buy into. And this is where like the kind of agroecological story and can kind of really overlap with markets, I think, because what you've done for me over 6 or 7 years is by accident create a really marketable product where we don't use, where what's coming off the farm doesn't perhaps have some of the negative externalities of a 29-tonne lorry load of 12 tonne per hectare winter wheat. I mean, I'm talking about climate, environment, welfare. And so people really buy into that. So simple pictures, Instagram, social media is a really soft way. I accidentally discovered that people really want to buy the pork and really want to buy the crops we're producing. I'm no marketing guru. So yeah, that's kind of, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think what's happening with this movement of bakers, there's a real interest from these artisan bakers in having that connection with the farmers. We had an event at Fred's Farm recently with bringing together bakers and a few millers as well, but actually the bakers are looking at potentially taking on that milling process because they're so inspired to bridge that connection, and they've got consumers that really want to have a direct connection to the farmers and be able to tell that story. But are you're both growing population wheat? I'd say a few words about that. That's really captured the imagination, I think, of the bakers.
So one of the big, I was mentioned earlier, I think we're going to roll over into another session where we can talk about the soil health side of the system a bit more. But there's 2 levers for me, and that's carbon and diversity. And diversity can be like a crosser rotation. It can be, within the crop as well. And one of the things with wheats is if you grow a modern variety of wheat, every plant in the field is genetically identical, which puts a huge amount of risk on the grower if it breaks down to a particular disease or pathogen in a season. And it also, it's kind of putting a square peg in a round hole, as it were, because does that variety do well with me, or does it do well over here, this side of the country with you, George? I mean, we have very, very different pressures. So you can build a huge amount of resilience from an agronomic perspective as a grower by putting diversity into a wheat crop. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily intercropping. It can mean taking for inspiration this idea of landrace wheats, which evolved 500-600 years ago with farmer saved seed in a specific location, and you gradually build up a kind of population of huge amount of diversity. The problem is when we say we grow landrace wheats now, they've come through a gene bank. So that's a big bottleneck to that diversity, because someone's probably saved 1 or 2 ears of wheat out of a field that evolved in that area for 300 or 400 years. But there's some really awesome work going on lately by Martin Wolf at Wakelands Agroforestry, and they've basically taken 20 modern wheat varieties and crossed them all together, and then grown the F1s out as a population, which gives you a huge amount of diversity, sort of 190, 200 different variants. And then there's another guy called Ed Dicken who works at Harper Adams, and what he's doing is he's crossing modern with heritage, and he's built up a population wheat at his own place with 40,000 different genotypes in the same field. So from a farmer perspective, the ability for that wheat crop to flux according to the specific conditions of that farm, that season, and then evolve and adapt over the years as well, is hugely powerful as a farmer trying to get towards a system where you're not necessarily boom and bust 12 tonne a hectare, 7 tonne a hectare, but you're happy to build a business model around a fixed yield, a very resilient yield, with very little fluctuation from year to year. So the population wheats have a really strong narrative as a farmer trying to move towards a low input system. But then also it's a really powerful narrative for the consumer as well. And there's bakers in the UK have really, really bought into this YQ population and have basically worked out a way to bake with it, because of the strong narrative that it brings with it.
Yeah, fantastic. I can't describe how impressed I was coming to your farm the other day with all of these heritage varieties that you'd got growing there, and so you're in year 2 of doing that.
Yeah,
how have you
years,
made it happen?
Well, basically, yeah, I wasn't the first person to ask the question whether modern varieties were suitable for low input systems, and probably won't be the last. Once you start winding your neck in on inputs, your farm starts telling you what it needs, and it doesn't want a short wheat, and it doesn't want herbicides, and it doesn't want nitrogen, and it doesn't want fungicides. So if you're thinking about what's the alternative? YQ is marketable, so you can get hold of YQ. But for me, that's also a modern plant breeding. The resources they've used are modern genetics. So I was interested in going behind that. And there's gene banks all across the world. There's one in the UK at the John Innes Centre. It's basically a library catalogue. Do some research online, and they'll send you about 5 or 6 grams of seed. First year you do it by hand. Second year we have a plot combine now and a plot drill. Third year it's farm scale, and within 4 years, we've gone from, so 4 years ago we put the first wheats and barleys in the ground, and we probably had 25-30 grams of them, and now we've got 170 acres in 4 years. It's a good example of the power of the mighty seed, really. And
well, just following on from that, so the strips is where, so Mark Lee, who's here tomorrow, I think, who's farming in Shropshire, is doing strips of his trial crops. So with about 40 kilos of seed, he does a field length strip of whatever it is. He's got YQ, which is yield quality, it's this composite cross population. He's got a Hen Gumro, which is Welsh wheat, which this year is celebrating its centenary as a collection. Although we are now starting to think, well, I'm trying to persuade Andy, that this is actually a population. Because it's about 200-300 years ago, Wales was absolutely pockmarked with arable all over the place, but they would have been growing for the local area, and that's it. And one of the things that one of the things that you're doing, which I think is brilliant, is talking to other people in the chain. So is there a miller? Is there a baker? So one of the things Mark's doing is being able to get maybe a ton of whatever it is at the end of harvest, and then we can get it to a mill. We've got enough to do a few test mills, some test bakes. Is it any good? We can get some of Ed's. So we've got some of Ed's varieties in this year. Hopefully we'll have. One he's crossed is Malika Holdfast. So Holdfast is 1930s, I think. Malika much more modern. And the two things complement each other. So in a low input system or an organic system, you need weed competitivity or weed competition from the crop. So not like the buckwheat, but perhaps like with the older weeds, they prostrate, they sort of smother. And one of the things we need to learn is how to get the seed, to bulk up the seed, but also how to grow those with less and less inputs. So one of the problems with the modern wheats is that they're bred primarily in a system where you've got a lot of inputs. And if you haven't, then what happens? So we run an event every year called National Organic Combinable Crops, and last year we were at Marks in Shropshire, and all the heritage wheats had far, far fewer weeds than the modern wheats. We went to his about 3 or 4 weeks before the event, which is the beginning of July. It's next week in Yorkshire, anybody wants to go. And the poppies were so red in the modern wheats that it hurt your eyes. I mean, it was just... And then that's a problem for each following year. So it's getting the seed, it's getting that out there, trying to bulk it up in a sensible way that doesn't compromise the existing farm business.
Has anyone out there got any questions? I've been asking all the questions here. Yep.
Shall I just shout?
No.
Hi, it's Graham. I know Steve. I don't know the other guys, but it's brilliant presentation, really interesting. I was just talking to Elizabeth Westerway about nutrition, and we don't talk enough about the nutritional importance of farming. Why do we farm? To produce food that's good. I'm just wondering whether you could say anything about nutritional content of the varieties you're growing. I'm sort of aware, I might be wrong, that modern wheats have high protein but also high gluten content, which could be linked to the sort of... So maybe I'm wrong on this one, but could you say something about the nutritional content of these wheats, and is that part of the marketing you can do with them?
There are, yes, and I think, I don't know if you guys have got anything to add to this, but there are two ways that I think of looking at this. One of them is the science. So the science, there is a paper, I've seen it. Andrew Whitley showed it to me. Over the last 160 years, there's been a decrease in the mineral density of wheat. Now, they're not sure why. It's probably a multiple set of reasons. It's yield, so that's diluted the quality. It's also the breeding, which is looking for a harvest index where you haven't got much going into the head other than to just bulk. Because that's what the market says it wants. But also I think it's because there's a lot of artificial fertiliser going in which disrupts the natural system. So on a farm like this it's different, because what John and Paul are doing is trying to get closer to that natural system. One could argue that the mineral density in a no-till system could be higher than a non-organic tillage system. Another aspect of looking at all of this, and the James Hutton Institute are running a research thing with Andrew Whitley on this, so I'm waiting to find out. Another way of looking at this, and the bakers tell me, flavour. So if the crops were bred for flavour, that could be an indicator of nutrient. But again, the science is out on that. But we've been talking to people like Harriet and others who are looking at how that translates not just in the science, but on to the palate and therefore to customer demand.
I'll just take that slightly further as well in terms of nutrition, which is to do with the way we actually process our foods. I mean, there's a lot of science out there that's saying that over the last 50 years, you now have to eat basically double the amount of calories for the same nutritional content. But some of that is also not just what we're growing, but how it is then post-processed. And certainly when you're talking about bread and you're talking about bioavailability, a lot of that is to do with how that bread is produced. So mass-produced bread, which, to be honest, most people's milling wheat crops would be going off to, when they're going off to Warburton's or Kingsmill or whatever like that, that is not a nutritional way to get the nutrition out of that food. If instead you go to an artisan baker who is making sourdough, you are making that nutrition much more bioavailable, and science they're saying it's 3 to 4 times more available as nutrition in that bread. So not only does it taste better, but it's much more nutritious. Even though if you were to analyse the nutrition on a very basic level, it would be the same. So I think it's a deeper question than just the crops in the ground. It's the post-processing as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting talk. My name's India. I'm from Jersey, and I run a consumer cooperative, work with about 8 farmers. You mentioned when you sat around the table with a baker, you can work out a price that's reasonable for all. I have to kind of talk a lot about price. We obviously have a market where people will pay a certain amount for something. Is there a percentage that you need to see from that consumer cost to guarantee that we could work on, that means that you see the right amount of money and everyone else sees it's sort of a rough guide?
Yeah, so I mean, I always think across a farm rather than a product. So for example, and I use our example of the pigs because it's a bit more established for me, we've been doing it 2 or 3 years. So I work out per hectare what profit I need to make my business resilient. And I like to get to between £400 and £500 per hectare profit per hectare every year before any single farm payment or subsidies, and that's a sustainable model for my business. If you start from knowing that that's where a farmer wants to get to, and then so for example, if we're simulating this now and the millers are around the table and the bakers are around the table, we all first of all need to make sure all of our values are aligned. What kind of product is it that we want and how do we want it produced? And then we want to set the outcomes really. So if the baker wants a stronger white looking wholemeal, then that depends on what seed we put in the ground. If the miller says, well actually I'm looking for extractability, if we do need to sift it, that dependence, and he can tell us, well actually if we start sifting it then we lose 30-40%, and all of these things can build a picture of what the price needs to be at the end, and also then I can feed in with saying, well okay, given all of those characteristics that you're looking for and the way you want it grown, the crop that I grow will be 5 tonnes a hectare. I need to make, the cost of production is X and I need to make £400 a hectare profit, and you can quite quickly get to a price that everybody needs. I think sort of as soon as you put a human face to the supply chain, it shouldn't be too tricky if everyone's values are aligned and everyone wants to pull in the same direction.
Another aspect to that, as you say about the sourdough bakers, is that you don't need to look at it on the spec that a conventional roller miller would. So normal wheats are sort of 12-13+% protein and about 250 Hagberg. So if you're looking at a lower protein but a higher Hagberg, which you would possibly get with the older wheats, sourdough